The smell of her perfume still haunts me. That night in the alley changed everything. I was just a nobody who saved America's sweetheart from danger, but what she whispered to me revealed the monster behind the movie star smile. I never had much. Growing up in downtown Los Angeles, my mom worked 3 jobs, and still we barely made rent on our 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood tourists were warned to avoid. I learned early that nobody would hand me anything in this life. By 16, I was skipping school more often than attending, finding ways to make cash that kept me fed, but constantly looking over my shoulder. The streets of LA taught me to be invisible when necessary and intimidating when required. I knew which alleys provided shelter on rainy nights and which store owners might offer day-old bread if I helped sweep their sidewalks. My world existed in the shadows of the glamorous Los Angeles that filled movie screens and magazines. I saw the billboards featuring perfectly airbrushed celebrities, but felt they existed in an entirely different universe. My friends were other kids like me. We formed a loose family, watching out for each other when we could. Miguel showed me how to fix bikes, a skill that occasionally earned me legitimate money. Darius taught me which pawn shops asked fewer questions. Layla reminded me to call my mum sometimes. We survived together in the cracks of society that the glittering city preferred to ignore. I had a talent for blending in, for making myself unseen when police cruisers rolled by or when tourists wandered too far from their hotels. This skill of invisibility served me well. I could move through crowds unnoticed, slipping past security, guards at events or festivals when hunger drove me to seek free food. The wealthy never truly saw people like me. Their eyes slid past as if I were made of smoke. One particular talent I developed was an awareness of danger. When you live on the streets, you develop a sixth sense for trouble. I could spot an undercover cop from 50 feet away. I knew which groups of men to avoid and which streets became hunting grounds after dark. That awareness saved my life more than once. It would eventually lead me to save someone else. My mom always told me I had a good heart despite my circumstances. She believed I would find my way to something better. I rarely shared her optimism. The world showed me repeatedly that people like us were destined to remain invisible, struggling until we eventually disappeared altogether. Still, I held on to small dreams, maybe a steady job someday, perhaps a room of my own. Los Angeles is a city of contrasts. Mansions in the hills overlook neighborhoods where children go hungry. Celebrities drive luxury cars past homeless encampments. The entertainment industry pumps billions into the economy, while people like my mother work themselves to exhaustion for minimum wage. I understood this disparity in my bones, felt it in every hungry night and every time I was chased from a store entrance where I sought shelter. By my 18th birthday, I had developed a reasonable hustle. I knew where film crews set up around the city and could often find work helping move equipment or running errands for production assistants who appreciated my ability to navigate the city quickly. The pay was under the table, but better than nothing. More importantly, it offered glimpses into the world I had only seen from a distance. These production jobs introduced me to the edges of celebrity culture. I saw how entourages formed protective bubbles around stars. I witnessed the deference paid to people whose faces appeared on screens. From my invisible position, I observed how some celebrities treated crew members with genuine kindness, while others behaved as if the world existed solely to serve them. I catalogued these observations, learning the ecosystem without ever expecting to truly enter it. My life operated in this liminal space, surviving on the margins while occasionally touching the fringes of glamour. I had no illusions about my place in this city. I was background detail, human scenery in someone else's story. That reality seemed permanent and unchangeable. I had no reason to believe anything would ever shift the boundaries between my world and theirs. Until one night in April, everything stayed predictably segregated. The wealthy and famous occupied their spotlights, while people like me navigated the shadows. I had no concept of how quickly worlds could collide, or how a single encounter could set off a chain of events that would ultimately consume us both. That night changed everything. That night, I met Elise Harlow. I first glimpsed Elise Harlow on a billboard promoting her latest romantic comedy when I was 15. Her face was plastered across Los Angeles, her perfect smile beaming down on the city that worshipped her. America's sweetheart, the magazines called her, the Oklahoma girl who came to Hollywood and conquered it with charm and talent. By 25, she had 3 Academy Award nominations and a reputation for kindness that seemed rare in the industry. I never imagined our paths would cross. Celebrities existed in a parallel universe to mine. They breathed different air and occupied spaces protected by security and wealth. They certainly never ventured into the back alleys near the warehouse district, where I sometimes slept when my mum had her boyfriend over. That April evening, I was cutting through my usual shortcuts, avoiding the main streets where police had been increasing patrols. Recent gang activity had everyone on edge, and my appearance often made me a target for questioning. The alley behind the old theatre provided a reliable passage, usually empty, except for the occasional rat or homeless person seeking shelter. The sound reached me first, a muffled struggle, the scrape of expensive shoes against pavement. Then, voices low and threatening. I should have turned around. Street wisdom dictated avoiding other people's problems. But something about the quality of the struggle made me pause. It sounded desperate, uneven. Someone was in genuine trouble. I crept forward, keeping to the shadows. The security lights from the nearby parking structure cast enough illumination to reveal 3 figures. 2 men in dark clothing had cornered a woman against the theater's emergency exit. One held her arm twisted behind her back, while the other pressed something against her side. They were speaking quietly, but urgently. The man holding her arm demanded she come quietly. He told her the car was waiting, and her people would receive instructions once she was secured. The woman tried to reason with them. She explained that her security team would be looking for her. She offered money. Her voice sounded controlled despite her situation, measured and oddly familiar. I recognized her in stages. First, the voice triggered a memory of interviews I had seen while lingering outside electronics stores. Then the profile, visible when she turned her head slightly. Finally, the distinctive auburn hair that countless magazines had featured. Elise Harlow, Hollywood royalty, was being kidnapped 20 feet from where I stood. My instinct for self-preservation warred with something else. Perhaps it was the stories my mother had told me about standing up for others. Maybe it was the strange sense that fate had placed me in this specific place at this precise moment. Whatever the reason, I found myself moving before fully deciding to act. The advantage of being overlooked most of my life is learning to use invisibility as a weapon. I approached silently, grabbing a discarded metal pipe from beside a dumpster. The men were focused entirely on Elise and controlling her without drawing attention. They never sensed me coming. The first man went down with a strike behind his knees. As he fell, I swung at the second man, catching him in the shoulder. He released Elise, spinning toward me with surprise and rage. He reached into his jacket, likely for a weapon. I did not give him the chance to retrieve it. Another swing connected with his head, sending him staggering back against the wall. Elise stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with shock. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her further into the alley, away from her attackers. My mind raced with escape routes, places we could hide until help arrived. She moved with me willingly, her breathing quick but controlled. We ran through the labyrinth of back passages I knew intimately, behind restaurants, through employee parking lots, past loading docks. Finally, I pulled her into an alcove hidden from the street, a spot I had used many times to escape notice. Only then did I release her wrist and step back. She studied me, with an intensity I found unsettling. Her eyes, famous for their expressive quality on screen, seemed to catalogue every detail of my appearance. I became acutely aware of my worn clothes, the dirt under my fingernails, the general evidence of my place in society. She did not speak immediately, and in that silence I felt the vast distance between our worlds. Finally, she asked who I was. I gave only my first name, Alex. She nodded slowly, still watching me with that measuring gaze. Then she asked if I knew who she was. I admitted that everyone knew Elise Harlow. A smile flickered across her face, not the dazzling expression from movie posters, but something smaller and more genuine. She told me she needed to contact her. Security team. I offered her my phone, a basic model I kept charged for emergencies. She made a brief call, speaking in clipped phrases that conveyed location and situation without details. When she finished, she returned the phone and told me her people would arrive within minutes. We waited in awkward silence, two people from entirely different realities suddenly sharing the same few feet of space. I expected her to be more shaken by the attempted abduction, but she displayed remarkable composure. She asked if I lived nearby. I gave a non-committal answer, uncomfortable with revealing the precarious nature of my housing situation. She seemed to understand my reticence. She shifted topics, asking how I had learned to move so quietly, to fight with such effectiveness. I explained that survival on the streets required certain skills. Her expression softened with what appeared to be genuine interest. She asked more questions about my life, listening with surprising attention to my vague responses. As sirens approached in the distance, she reached into her purse and withdrew a business card. She told me she owed me more than a simple thank you. She wanted to properly express her gratitude. The card contained a number she assured me would reach her directly, not an assistant or manager. She asked me to call the following day. Before her security team arrived, she stepped closer. The scent of her perfume enveloped me, expensive and unfamiliar. She leaned in as if to share a secret. Her whisper was soft against my ear, intimate in a way that made my skin tingle. She told me that I had not only saved her life, but provided her with something equally valuable, an opportunity. She needed someone like me, someone invisible who could move through the world unnoticed. Black SUVs appeared at the end of the alley. Men in suits approached rapidly, hands near concealed weapons. Elise squeezed my arm once, then stepped away, transforming before my eyes. The genuine interest vanished, replaced by the practiced vulnerability I had seen in her films. She became visibly shaken, a delicate victim in need of protection. She told the security team I had rescued her from kidnappers. She pointed toward the location of the attack, carefully steering them away from questioning me too deeply. As they escorted her toward the vehicles, she glanced back once. The look we exchanged contained a promise, though I did not yet understand its implications. I called the number the next day, expecting to reach a disconnected line or a secretary who would politely dismiss me. Instead, Elise herself answered. She invited me to her home in the hills that afternoon. She sent a car, a sleek black sedan, with tinted windows. The driver asked no questions, simply verified my name and transported me to an address I could never have approached otherwise. Her home was everything I had imagined a star's residence would be. Sprawling, pristine, with views overlooking the city where I scratched out my existence. Elise greeted me with apparent warmth, dressed casually but still immaculate. She gave me a brief tour, then led me to a sunroom where lunch had been arranged. As we ate food more expensive than anything I had ever tasted, she explained her proposition. She needed someone with my particular skills, someone who understood the streets, who could move undetected, who noticed things others missed. She described it as a security position of sorts, though the responsibilities seemed vague. The compensation she offered was substantial, life-changing for someone in my position. I asked why she would trust a stranger from the streets. Her answer, seemed rehearsed yet convincing. She claimed to have good instincts about people. She believed in giving opportunities. Most importantly, she said, I had proven my character by helping her without expectation of reward. Looking back, I should have questioned her more thoroughly. The arrangement seemed too perfect, the timing too convenient. But the allure of escape from poverty blinded me to inconsistencies. I accepted her offer with a gratitude that embarrasses me now. The following weeks unfolded like a dream. Elise provided an apartment in a building she owned. She arranged for new clothes, appropriate for the environments I would now occupy. She introduced me as her new security consultant, a vague title that granted access without inviting too many questions. My official duties involved accompanying her to certain events, assessing locations for potential threats, and occasionally handling sensitive errands. The real work, I soon discovered, was considerably different. Elise was preparing for a major career transformation. She wanted to pivot from romantic comedies to serious dramatic roles. This transition required a new public image, one with depth and authenticity. This is where my true value emerged. Elise used my life story, carefully edited and enhanced, as inspiration for her new persona. She had me describe in detail the hardships of street life, the struggle for daily survival, the invisibility of poverty. She recorded these conversations, claiming they helped her understand characters she hoped to portray. I shared personal experiences I had never voiced aloud. The time I went 3 days without food, the night I huddled in a doorway during a rainstorm so cold I thought I might die, the constant fear of violence that shaped my movements through the city. She absorbed these stories with apparent empathy, asking questions that seemed genuine in their concern. Simultaneously, she began appearing at homeless shelters and youth outreach programs. Photographers always seemed to materialize during these visits. She spoke passionately in interviews about developing social consciousness, about seeing the invisible members of society. The entertainment press praised her evolution from pretty face to serious advocate. 6 months into our arrangement, Elise was cast in the role that would transform her career. She would play a social worker who forms a connection with a homeless teenager. The parallels to our relationship were obvious to me, but invisible to everyone else. Only I knew she was mining my life for her performance. I told myself this exchange was fair. She provided financial security and a new life. I provided authenticity for her career rebirth. The unease I occasionally felt seemed like ingratitude. When she asked me to coach the young actor playing the homeless teen, ensuring his performance rang true, I complied without complaint. The film began production 9 months after our first meeting. Elise invited me to visit the set, ostensibly to provide feedback on the portrayal of street life. What I witnessed there opened my eyes to the true nature of our arrangement. The set included a meticulously constructed replica of the very alley where I had saved her. The scene being filmed depicted their first meeting, but the narrative had been completely rewritten. In this version, the social worker spots the teen attempting to steal and intervenes with compassion rather than judgment. Watching Elise perform, I recognized my own gestures, expressions I had seen only in reflections. She had studied me as thoroughly as she studied the character. More disturbing were the lines of dialogue. Words I had spoken in confidence now emerged from the actor's mouth. My life had been transformed into entertainment. During a break in filming, I confronted Elise in her trailer. I asked why she had recreated our meeting with such fundamental changes. Her response revealed everything. She explained that the truth lacked narrative elegance. A random rescue in an alley might seem contrived to audiences. The revised version provided better character motivation and a clearer story arc. I reminded her that she had promised privacy regarding my personal history. She seemed genuinely confused by my objection. She assured me that she had changed names and specific details. She told me I should feel honored that my experiences would touch so many lives through her performance. She reminded me of everything she had done for me, lifting me from poverty to comfort. As she spoke, her mask slipped, the warmth in her eyes cooled to calculation. She assessed my reaction with the detachment of someone evaluating a resource rather than addressing a person. In that moment, I understood the truth that had been present from the beginning. I was never her friend or protégé. I was raw material to be processed into her next career achievement. Before I could respond further, her assistant knocked on the trailer door. Elise was needed back on set. As she prepared to leave, she turned to me with an expression of practiced sincerity. She told me that once filming completed, we should discuss a more formal arrangement to compensate me for my inspirational contributions. Her tone made it clear this was meant to placate rather than address my concerns. Left alone in her trailer, I noticed a production binder on her desk. Inside were scene breakdowns, character notes, and background research. An entire section was labeled with my name. It contained transcripts of our conversations, observations about my mannerisms, and behavioral patterns noted by someone with a psychologist's precision. My entire being had been reduced to study notes for her performance. More revealing was a series of emails between Elise and her publicist. They discussed the narrative they would construct around the film's creation. They planned a heartwarming story about Elise encountering a homeless youth volunteer during research and forming a mentorship. My actual role in her life would be erased entirely, replaced with a fictional account that better served her image. The final evidence came in a draft interview where Elise discussed her inspiration. She described creating a composite character based on various individuals she had met during her social justice awakening. She specifically noted that her portrayal was not based on any single person. My existence had been deliberately fragmented. My identity dissolved into a collection of generic hardships that would enhance her reputation for thoroughness and sensitivity. As I replaced the binder exactly as I had found it, I recalled the whispered words from our first meeting. She had said I provided an opportunity. I had interpreted this as her recognizing my potential. Now I understood she had immediately identified me as a resource to be mined. My invisibility, which had once protected me on the streets, had made me the perfect subject for her exploitation. No one would believe my version of events over hers. That night in my apartment, the apartment she had provided, I faced the truth of my situation. Everything I now possessed came with invisible strings. My comfort depended entirely on my continued cooperation with her narrative. I had escaped physical poverty only to enter a different kind of imprisonment. As I stared at the city lights spread below my window, the whispered words from the alley echoed in my mind. An opportunity. Not for me, but for her. She had recognized immediately how useful I could be, how perfectly my life experiences could serve her ambitions. The rescue had not been the beginning of our story. It had been the commencement of my exploitation. The next morning, I returned to the set with new awareness. I watched Elise perform scenes inspired directly by confidential conversations we had shared. I observed her practicing gestures and expressions she had studied from me. Most painfully, I witnessed her receiving praise for the authenticity she had simply appropriated from my life. During lunch, she introduced me to a reporter conducting a set visit. She presented me as a consultant hired to ensure the authentic portrayal of homelessness. The reporter asked about my qualifications. Before I could answer, Elise smoothly interjected that I had worked extensively with outreach programs. She was erasing my actual experiences even as she exploited them, creating a sanitized version that would not complicate her narrative. Later that day, I overheard Elise speaking with her director. They discussed the third act of the film, where the social worker helps the teen confront his abusive father. This plot point had been inspired by a painful confession I had shared about my own father. Hearing them dissect this trauma as a dramatic device made me physically ill. That evening, Elise invited me to dinner at an exclusive restaurant. Over expensive wine, she outlined her vision for our continued partnership. The film was already generating positive industry buzz. She planned to establish a foundation addressing youth homelessness, with me serving as a program coordinator. She described media appearances we would make together, carefully scripted to enhance both the film's reception and her personal brand. Throughout her monologue, she never once acknowledged the fundamental dishonesty of her actions. She spoke as if this arrangement benefited everyone equally. She genuinely seemed to believe that providing me with material comfort justified mining my trauma for her professional advancement. When she finally paused for my response, I asked a simple question. I asked if she ever intended to publicly acknowledge that her acclaimed performance was based specifically on me, on my actual experiences and personality. Her hesitation revealed everything. She explained that attributing the character to a single individual would diminish the universality of the story. She assured me I would be generously credited as a consultant. In that moment, the final illusion shattered. I realized Elise Harlow, beloved by millions for her authenticity and warmth, existed only on screens and in carefully managed public appearances. The real woman sitting across from me was something entirely different. She was a collector of experiences she had never lived, an appropriator of struggles she had never faced. As I looked into her eyes, I saw not malice, but something perhaps more disturbing. She genuinely believed herself entitled to whatever resources enhanced her art, including the intimate details of others' lives. My pain was simply raw material for her craft. My identity was a resource to be harvested, then discarded. I agreed to her proposals with a smile that mirrored her own practiced insincerity. As we clinked glasses to our continued collaboration, a plan began forming in my mind. She had taught me inadvertently the power of performance. She had demonstrated how effectively stories could be constructed and controlled. Most importantly, she had shown me that authenticity in Hollywood was simply another commodity to be manufactured and sold. If Elise Harlow could transform herself from romantic comedy darling to serious dramatic artist using my life as her template, perhaps I could engineer a transformation of my own. Perhaps I could construct a narrative that would reveal the truth behind her carefully crafted image. Perhaps I could use her own methods to dismantle the empire she was building on my experiences. That night, as I returned to the apartment she had provided, I made a decision. I would not confront her directly. I would not make accusations that would be easily dismissed. Instead, I would document, gather evidence, and quietly prepare. I would become the author of my own story rather than a character in hers. The filming continued for another 6 weeks. I remained present, observant, and apparently cooperative. I recorded conversations on my phone. I photographed documents when opportunities arose. I built relationships with crew members who spoke freely around someone they perceived as insignificant despite my title. Throughout this period, I maintained my facade of gratitude and loyalty. I accompanied Elise to charity events where she spoke passionately about giving voice to the voiceless. I stood quietly in the background as she gave interviews about her transformative experience creating this film. I smiled appropriately when introduced as her inspiration, though she never clarified the extent of that inspiration. The deeper I went into Elise's world, the more clearly I saw the elaborate machinery that maintained her public image. Her authenticity was manufactured by a team of specialists. Her spontaneous acts of kindness were meticulously planned for maximum publicity. Her evolution as an artist and advocate had been strategized years in advance, waiting only for the right opportunity. For me, when filming wrapped, Elise hosted a celebration at her home. During the party, I overheard her speaking with the producer about her next project. She mentioned having found another unique resource, a woman who had survived a cult experience. The familiar language made my stomach turn. Elise had already identified her next subject to study, and mine. In that moment, watching her describe how thoroughly she would inhabit this unknown woman's trauma, my resolve solidified. This pattern of exploitation would continue indefinitely unless someone intervened. Each subject would believe themselves special, chosen. Each would be discarded once their utility ended. I had an obligation to break this cycle. The film entered post-production. Elise began the publicity circuit, giving carefully crafted interviews about her creative process. She described immersing herself in homeless communities, spending nights in shelters to understand the experience. These were complete fabrications. Her research had consisted entirely of extracting my experiences while living in luxury. I was included in some of these appearances, presented as a success story and consultant. My role was tightly controlled. I received media training that amounted to instructions on validating Elise's narrative without adding unauthorized details. My own story was redacted and revised to better complement her journey of artistic growth. During this period, my planning intensified. I organized the evidence I had gathered. I identified journalists known for investigative integrity rather than celebrity flattery. I prepared my account of events, supported by recordings, documents, and witnesses who had observed our interactions. As the film's release approached, early screenings generated Oscar buzz for Elise's performance. Critics praised her ability to disappear into the role, to convey authentic struggle without sentimentality. Reading these reviews, which unknowingly described her appropriation of my mannerisms and experiences, strengthened my determination. The final betrayal came at the premiere. Elise had promised me a meaningful acknowledgement in the film's credits. When the movie ended and the names scrolled, I found myself listed as a general consultant alongside dozens of others. My contribution had been deliberately minimized, ensuring I remained a footnote rather than a recognized source. At the after-party, industry power players congratulated Elise on her bravest performance to date. A famous director commented on the remarkable authenticity she had achieved. Elise, champagne in hand, explained her intensive preparation process. She described spending time with various outreach organizations. She mentioned shadowing social workers. She never once glanced in my direction as she erased me from her narrative. Later that evening, slightly intoxicated from celebration, Elise pulled me aside. She thanked me for my discretion throughout the process. She assured me that the foundation she had promised was being established. Then came the revelation that confirmed my worst suspicions. She explained that my involvement with the foundation would need to remain administrative rather than public-facing. Market research indicated audiences responded better to success, stories with less complicated backgrounds. In simple terms, my actual history was too raw, too unmarketable for her charitable brand. I had been useful as a source, but would be a liability as a visible partner. She delivered this news with practiced compassion, her hand on my arm, her expression calibrated to convey regretful necessity. I maintained my facade of understanding. I expressed gratitude for all she had done. I assured her I respected her decision regarding the foundation. As we parted, she seemed relieved, already focusing on the industry figures she needed to charm that evening. I was effectively dismissed, my utility diminished now that the film was completed. Watching her work the room, moving from one influential person to another with practiced warmth, I recognized the perfect moment had arrived. Elise Harlow had reached the pinnacle of her reinvention. The film would likely earn her the Academy Award that had previously eluded her. Her transformation from rom-com star to serious artist and advocate was nearly complete. She had everything she wanted, everything she had engineered since the night in the alley, everything built on the foundation of my experiences, everything dependent on the continued silence of the invisible young man she had used as raw material for her masterpiece, everything now vulnerable to the truth I was prepared to reveal. Emotional aftermath, the days following the premiere unfolded in slow motion. I moved through my routine mechanically, while my mind processed the full extent of the betrayal. Elise called twice, leaving cheerful messages about scheduling appearances at homeless youth centers to promote the film. Her voice held no acknowledgement of her dismissal of me at the party. Perhaps, in her reality, it had been a minor conversation rather than a fundamental rejection. I returned to the apartment she had provided, seeing it with new clarity. The furniture, the views, the amenities. None of it represented genuine generosity. Each element was strategic, designed to create indebtedness, to ensure my continued cooperation in her narrative. The space itself was a gilded cage, a containment system for a resource she needed to control. Sleep became elusive. I lay awake, reconstructing our entire relationship from the beginning. The supposed coincidence of our meeting now seemed suspect. Had the kidnapping attempt been real or staged? Had she identified me beforehand, researched my background, arranged the entire scenario to establish herself as my savior? The possibility haunted me. Even if the initial encounter had been genuine, everything that followed had been calculated, the questions disguised as friendly interest, the recordings justified as acting preparation, the gradual extraction of my most painful memories, all while positioning herself as my benefactor. The imbalance of power had been absolute from the first moment. I found myself returning to the streets where I had once lived, seeking the clarity that came with remembered hardship. I walked through the alleys and hidden passages that had been my domain. I visited the spot where we had first met. Standing there, I recalled her whispered words about opportunity. The memory carried new significance, heavy with intentionality that I had missed entirely. During this period of reflection, the film opened nationwide to critical acclaim and strong box office. I watched television interviews where Elise described her creative journey. She spoke of responsibility when portraying marginalized people. She emphasized the research and care that went into her performance. Each word was technically true, yet fundamentally false. Most painful were her descriptions of creating the character through observation and imagination. She presented her process as one of artistic synthesis rather than direct appropriation. When asked about consultants, she mentioned working with various experts and individuals with lived experience. My contribution was diluted into a collective, rendering me effectively invisible once again. I attempted to contact some of the reporters. Uncovering the film, I offered my perspective as the primary inspiration for the story. The responses revealed Elise's thorough preparation. Some never replied. Others explained that the production company had provided an approved list of interview subjects. One honest journalist admitted that speaking to me might jeopardize their access to future projects. My growing anger found no productive outlet. I considered public confrontation, perhaps at one of her appearances or interviews. I imagined the momentary satisfaction of challenging her narrative before being removed by security, labeled unstable or opportunistic. The power differential ensured any direct approach would fail. She had an infrastructure of protection. I had only my word. During this dark period, I received a text from Miguel, one of my old friends from the street. He had seen the film and recognized elements of my life story, details I had shared during our years together. He asked if I had received compensation or credit, His message crystallized my understanding of the exploitation. Others could see it. It was not my imagination or ingratitude. I arranged to meet Miguel at a diner far from the hills where Elise and her circle operated. Seeing him was a stark reminder of the life I had lived before. He had found stable work as a mechanic, but still carried the wariness that street life instills. We spoke carefully at first, testing the boundaries of our reconnection. Eventually, I shared the truth of my situation. I described meeting Elisa, the opportunities offered, and the gradual realization that I was being studied rather than mentored. Miguel listened without interruption, his expression darkening as the story unfolded. When I finished, he asked a simple question that cut through my confusion. He asked what I intended to do about it. The directness of his inquiry forced me to confront my own passivity. I had been reacting to Elise's manipulations rather than asserting agency. I had allowed shock and betrayal to immobilize me. Miguel reminded me of our shared history of survival against difficult odds. He reminded me that I had never been a victim before meeting Elise, and I need not remain one now. That conversation marked a turning point. I returned to the apartment with renewed purpose. I spread my collected evidence across the dining table. Recordings, photographs of documents, notes from conversations. I organized everything chronologically, creating a clear narrative of systematic exploitation. As I worked, my phone buzzed with a message from Elise. Her film had been nominated for several major awards. She invited me to attend the ceremonies as part of her entourage. The message included a reminder that such visibility could benefit the foundation work she had promised. The manipulation was evident in every word. My presence would validate her narrative, while the implied future opportunities would ensure my continued compliance. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I continued assembling my documentation. I created secure digital copies of everything. I wrote a detailed account of our relationship from beginning to end, focusing on specific instances where she had extracted my experiences for her performance without attribution or compensation. 3 days later, I replied to Elise. I accepted her invitation with apparent enthusiasm. I expressed gratitude for the opportunity to witness her well-deserved recognition. My message was a performance worthy of her own skills, containing exactly the appropriate level of deference and appreciation. Her response came quickly. She was pleased I would attend. Her stylist would arrange appropriate attire. Her assistant would coordinate logistics. I was instructed to attend a briefing where I would receive guidelines for interacting with press if approached. Every aspect of my participation would be controlled, my role carefully defined. That night, I made the decision that would alter both our futures. I would not seek merely to expose Elise's methods. That approach risked being dismissed as the complaints of an ungrateful beneficiary. Instead, I would use her own techniques against her. I would construct a counter-narrative as compelling as the one she had created, but grounded in documented truth rather than appropriation. The weeks before the award ceremony passed in focused preparation. I met with Miguel and 2 other trusted friends from my previous life. I shared my plan, refined by their perspectives and knowledge of survival in hostile environments. They offered resources, connections, and most importantly, validation that my course of action was justified. I researched previous cases of artistic appropriation, particularly those involving powerful figures and marginalized subjects. I studied the outcomes, noting which approaches had succeeded and which had failed. I identified patterns in how such allegations were typically discredited or minimized. I prepared countermeasures for each common defense. Throughout this period, I maintained my apparent cooperation with Elise and her team. I attended fittings for awards ceremony attire. I participated in preparation sessions where I received approved talking points if approached by media. I accepted a carefully edited biography that would be provided to press if questions arose about my connection to the film. As the ceremony approached, Elise increased contact, apparently seeking to reinforce our connection. She invited me to dinner at her home, an intimate gathering with just her director and producer. During the evening, she reminisced about our first meeting, her version significantly revised to emphasize her immediate recognition of my potential rather than her exploitation of my experiences. The director, slightly intoxicated, commented on the remarkable similarity between my mannerisms and those Elise had adopted for the character. He complimented her ability to absorb and transform her observations into art. Neither of them seemed aware of the revealing nature of their discussion. To them, this appropriation was simply the creative process, worthy of admiration rather than ethical examination. Later that evening, alone with Elise in her kitchen, I carefully introduced the subject of credit. I mentioned that several of my former acquaintances had recognized my life story in the film. I suggested that a more formal acknowledgement might address potential questions about the character's origins. Her response revealed everything. She explained that artistic creation required a certain mythology. Audiences responded to narratives of divine inspiration rather than direct sourcing. A specific attribution would transform her performance from transcendent art to mere imitation in the public perception. Her career advancement depended on maintaining the illusion of creative alchemy rather than acknowledging appropriation. As she spoke, her expression remained compassionate while her words denied my right to recognition. She reminded me of all she had provided: the apartment, the clothing, the foundation position. She presented these as generous compensation rather than strategic investments in her source material. She assured me that my contribution was deeply valued, even if publicly unacknowledged. I nodded with apparent understanding. I expressed appreciation for her explanation. I assured her I simply wanted to support her success in whatever way proved most beneficial. My performance matched hers in conviction while concealing my true intentions. I had learned from the master of manipulation how to present a believable facade. The night before the award ceremony, I finalized my preparations. I confirmed arrangements with the journalist who had agreed to meet me. I secured my evidence in multiple locations. I rehearsed my account, ensuring I could present it clearly and credibly, even under pressure. I considered potential consequences and accepted them as necessary. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. The decision to reclaim my narrative brought a peace that had eluded me throughout my relationship with Elise. Whatever the outcome, I would no longer be merely a resource to be harvested. I would be the author of my own story. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a sense of inevitability. As the styling team prepared me for my role as Elise Harlow's inspirational success story, I maintained perfect composure. I expressed appropriate excitement about the evening ahead. I reviewed the approved responses for potential media interactions. I played my assigned part flawlessly. Elise herself arrived midday, radiant with anticipated triumph. Award season had already brought her numerous accolades for the performance built from my experiences. Tonight's ceremony represented the pinnacle, the industry's highest recognition. She greeted me with practiced warmth, squeezing my arm as she expressed her pleasure that I would witness her moment of achievement. As her team made final preparations, she took me aside for a private conversation. She thanked me for my contribution to her artistic journey. She promised that after tonight's likely victory, she would ensure the foundation work proceeded quickly. My future was secure as long as our partnership continued in its established pattern. Then, with seeming sincerity. She told me she hoped I understood why public acknowledgement remained impossible. The narrative had been established. Altering it now would raise questions about authenticity that could undermine everything we had built together. She presented this decision as protecting our shared interests rather than preserving her sole claim to creative achievement. I assured her I understood completely. I told her I was grateful for all she had taught me about storytelling, about creating and controlling narratives. Her smile in response contained genuine pleasure at what she perceived as my acceptance of subordinate status in our relationship. She did not recognize the warning hidden within my gratitude. As we departed for the ceremony, I maintained perfect and calm. The red carpet awaited Elise Harlow and her carefully constructed persona. The cameras would capture her practiced humility and eloquent passion for social causes. The industry would celebrate her remarkable transformation from lightweight star to serious artist, and somewhere in that carefully orchestrated spectacle, the truth was about to emerge. The real story behind the performance everyone praised for its authenticity, the actual source of the experiences being celebrated as artistic achievement. The voice that had been silenced was prepared to speak. Revenge planning. The drive to the award ceremony provided time for final mental preparation. The limousine interior felt oppressively intimate, with Elise beside me reviewing her acceptance speech on a tablet. Her publicist sat opposite, occasionally offering suggestions to enhance emotional impact or strengthen connections to current social concerns. They discussed the speech as a strategic document rather than an expression of genuine gratitude. I observed their calculated approach to what most viewers would perceive as spontaneous emotion. Every pause for apparent composure was planned. Every seemingly impromptu acknowledgement was carefully selected for maximum effect. The entire performance had been engineered to reinforce Elise's new persona as serious artist and advocate. Watching this process unfold confirmed the rightness of my decision. The woman beside me had built a career on manufactured authenticity. She had positioned herself as a voice for the voiceless, while simultaneously silencing the actual voice she had appropriated. The disconnect between public perception and private reality had become intolerable. My phone vibrated with a message from the journalist who had agreed to meet me. She confirmed our arrangement for immediately after the ceremony. An experienced investigative reporter with a reputation for integrity, she had expressed interest in my story without making promises about publication. She required convincing evidence, which I was prepared to provide. As we approached the venue, Elise turned to me with a final instruction disguised as friendly advice. She suggested I avoid detailed discussions about my background if approached by media. Brief acknowledgements of our working relationship were acceptable, but personal history should remain vague. My role was to confirm her narrative without introducing complications. I assured her I understood my position. My tone must have contained some element that triggered her suspicion. She studied me briefly, her performer's sensitivity detecting an inconsistency in my presentation. Then her publicist announced our arrival, and the moment passed. Elise activated her public persona, readying herself for the cameras awaiting her appearance. The red carpet experience passed in a blur of lights, shouted questions, and Elise's practiced responses. I remained in the background, part of her entourage, but carefully separated from media attention. Occasionally, she would draw me forward, introducing me as a consultant who had provided valuable insights. These moments were choreographed to display her inclusivity without risking uncontrolled narratives. Inside the venue, we were seated prominently, befitting Elise's nominee status. Industry power players stopped by to wish her luck, each interaction revealing the complex web of relationships that maintained Hollywood's ecosystem. I observed the subtle hierarchies, the performance of mutual admiration, the strategic positioning for future collaborations. Throughout the preliminary awards, I maintained appropriate responses. I applauded at the right moments. I leaned in for whispered comments from Elise. I performed the role of honored guest with the same precision she brought to her characters. Beneath this facade, I reviewed my plan for the remainder of the evening. The moment her category was announced, Elise grasped my hand. The gesture appeared affectionate to observers, but functioned as a claim of ownership. Her fingers tightened as the nominees were listed, her nails pressing into my palm. When her name was called as winner, her expression transformed into perfect surprise and humility. I watched her proceed to the stage, accepting embraces from colleagues along the way. Her walk, her posture, her entire physical presence incorporated elements she had studied from me. My way of occupying space when uncertain. My habit of slight hesitation before speaking. My tendency to maintain physical distance except with trusted individuals, all appropriated and refined for her performance. Her acceptance speech began with appropriate gratitude to the industry, the director, her fellow cast members. She acknowledged the production team and her personal staff. Then came the portion addressing the film's social significance. She spoke passionately about giving voice to those society renders invisible. She described her process of immersion in understanding the experiences of marginalized communities. As she continued, she introduced a narrative about discovering authentic perspective through unexpected connection. Without naming me directly, she referenced a special individual whose insights had proven invaluable. She described our relationship as a beautiful example of art transcending social boundaries. She presented herself as a conduit for experiences she could never personally claim. The careful phrasing maintained her position as creative interpreter rather than appropriator. She received applause for her apparent humility and social consciousness. The audience, unaware of the reality behind her words, celebrated what seemed like remarkable sensitivity and artistic integrity. Watching her performance from my seat, I experienced a strange detachment. The person being celebrated existed only in carefully constructed public moments. The actual woman I knew operated with calculated self-interest, disguised as artistic purpose and social concern. The disparity had become unbearable. When Elise returned to her seat, trophy in hand, she embraced me with cameras capturing the moment. She whispered that we had achieved this together, though only her name would appear on the award. The statement, intended to appear generous, revealed the fundamental inequity of our relationship. My life experiences had value only as raw material for her artistic achievement. Following the ceremony, we proceeded to the most prestigious after-party. Elise moved through the space receiving congratulations, introducing me occasionally as her consultant and inspiration. Each introduction carefully limited my role to supporting her achievement rather than being its primary source. At a predetermined time, I excused myself, claiming a need for fresh air. Elise, surrounded by industry admirers, barely acknowledged my departure. Her attention had already shifted to leveraging her victory for future opportunities. My utility for the evening had diminished once her win was secured. Outside, I met the journalist at the arranged location. Away from the main event, but close enough to maintain plausibility for my absence, we found relative privacy in a service corridor. I provided her with digital copies of my evidence, recordings of Elise describing how she would use my experiences without attribution. Photographs of her research notes explicitly documenting my mannerisms and speech patterns for incorporation into her performance. Most damaging was the recording from her home, where she explicitly rejected proper acknowledgement of my contribution. Her explanation that audiences preferred the myth of artistic creation over the reality of appropriation revealed her prioritization of career advancement over ethical consideration. The journalist reviewed the material with professional detachment. She asked precise questions about timelines and contexts. She confirmed the authenticity of recordings and documents. She inquired about my motivation, whether financial compensation was my objective. I explained that recognition, not money, was my primary concern. I wanted acknowledgement of my role in creating the character that had earned Elise her highest achievement. I wanted transparency about the process that had been misrepresented as artistic inspiration rather than direct appropriation. I wanted to reclaim authorship of my own life story. The journalist made no promises about publication timeline or approach. She explained the necessary verification process and potential legal review. She cautioned that Elise's team would likely mount an aggressive response challenging my credibility and motives. She asked if I was prepared for public scrutiny and potential backlash. I confirmed my readiness for whatever consequences might follow. I had considered the possibilities extensively. Best case, Elise would be compelled to acknowledge my contribution and modify her narrative about the creative process. Worst case, I would be discredited and potentially face legal action for violating confidentiality expectations. The risk seemed worthwhile compared to continued erasure. Before returning to the party, I provided the journalist with contact information for Miguel and two other individuals who could corroborate elements of my account. They had agreed to verify that specific experiences depicted in the film were events I had shared with them years before meeting Elise. Their testimony would establish the direct correlation between my life and the celebrated performance. I re-entered the celebration with renewed purpose. I located Elise among a group of executives discussing her next project. She introduced me with her usual measured acknowledgement, then smoothly redirected conversation to her artistic vision. I performed perfect supportiveness, giving no indication of the process now initiated. Throughout the remainder of the evening, I maintained appropriate enthusiasm about her victory. I accepted congratulations from those who recognized me as somehow connected to the film. I engaged in conversations about the importance of authentic representation in storytelling. The irony of discussing authenticity while participating in its fabrication was not lost on me. As the night concluded, Elise suggested I join a smaller gathering at a private home. The invitation appeared inclusive, but served specific purpose. By keeping me within her orbit, she maintained surveillance of her primary resource. By introducing me to industry figures as her protégé, she reinforced her narrative of benevolent mentorship rather than exploitation. I accepted with apparent gratitude. During the intimate gathering, I observed Elise in her element, leveraging her fresh victory to secure commitment for future projects. She discussed her continued interest in socially relevant storytelling. She referenced her newly established foundation addressing youth homelessness. She positioned herself as an artist with purpose beyond entertainment. When the conversation turned to her research process, I paid particular attention. She described immersion in environments relevant to her characters. She emphasized the importance of respectful observation rather than appropriation. She presented herself as a conduit for important stories rather than their originator. A prominent director asked specifically about her preparation for the award-winning role. He inquired whether working directly with individuals from similar backgrounds had influenced her approach. The question created perfect opportunity to acknowledge my contribution. Instead, Elise described composite creation. She explained that basing a character on any single individual would limit artistic interpretation and potentially exploit vulnerable subjects. She positioned her approach as ethically superior to direct representation. She described building the character from careful observation of multiple sources combined with artistic intuition. The response was masterfully constructed to appear both humble and principled, while completely erasing my specific contribution. She established plausible deniability regarding any direct appropriation. She framed her process as protection of vulnerable subjects rather than exploitation of their experiences. I maintained neutral expression throughout this explanation. I avoided eye contact with Elise, focusing instead on other guests' reactions. They received her account with appreciative nods, impressed by her apparent ethical consideration and artistic sophistication. None questioned the fundamental dishonesty of her description. As the gathering concluded near dawn, Elise arranged transportation back to my apartment. In the car, slightly intoxicated from celebration, she expressed satisfaction with the evening's success. She assured me the foundation work would proceed quickly, now that award season had confirmed her credibility in serious social engagement. I responded with appropriate enthusiasm. I inquired about specific timeline for the foundation launch. I asked about my role in its development and operation. The questions appeared motivated by eager participation rather than suspicion of empty promises. Her answers remained vague, despite their confident delivery. The foundation required proper infrastructure. Legal considerations needed addressing. Strategic partnerships must be established. The process would take time to ensure long-term viability. All reasonable explanations that collectively suggested indefinite delay. When we arrived at my building, Elise surprised me by exiting the car to continue our conversation. Perhaps sensing my unspoken skepticism, she felt need for more direct reassurance. Standing in the pre-dawn quiet, she placed her hands on my shoulders in a gesture simultaneously intimate and controlling. She told me that tonight marked the beginning of our real partnership. The award validated everything we had built together. The foundation would create opportunities for others like me to find their voices through creative mentorship. She presented a vision of expanding the very dynamic that had exploited my experiences, positioning it as social benefit rather than personal advancement. As she spoke, I recognized the performance for what it was. Another manipulation designed to maintain my cooperation. Another promise with built-in deniability. Another assertion of her narrative control. The realization strengthened my resolve regarding the course already initiated. I expressed gratitude for her vision and commitment. I assured her of my continued dedication to our shared goals. I performed excitement about our future collaboration. The exchange concluded with her apparent satisfaction that her resource remained secured. After she departed, I entered my apartment with clear understanding of what would follow. The journalist would verify my account and supporting evidence. The publication would likely contact Elise for comment before releasing the story. Her team would mobilize immediately to discredit me and contain potential damage. The carefully constructed narrative would face its first significant challenge. I secured additional copies of all evidence in locations outside my apartment. I anticipated possible attempts to characterize me as unstable, ungrateful, or opportunistic. I prepared responses to likely accusations without defending against them preemptively. I documented all recent interactions to establish clear timeline. Preceding publication. Most importantly, I contacted Miguel and arranged temporary relocation. The apartment Elise had provided would likely become untenable once the story emerged. I needed independent housing secured before surrendering the leverage of her apparent generosity. Miguel offered his spare room without hesitation, understanding the significance of establishing separation from her influence. Over the following days, I maintained normal routines while finalizing preparations. I attended a scheduled meeting regarding the foundation, taking detailed notes about promises made and timelines established. I participated in a photo shoot for a magazine feature about Elise's advocacy work. I accepted a lunch invitation where she outlined potential speaking engagements about our supposed mentorship relationship. Throughout these interactions, I provided no indication of impending disruption. I performed continued gratitude and cooperation. I collected final evidence of her systematic myth-making about our relationship and her creative process. I secured financial resources sufficient for immediate independence once separation became necessary. Exactly 9 days after the awards ceremony, I received confirmation from the journalist. The story would run the following morning. The publication had completed verification of my account and supporting evidence. Elise's team had been contacted for comment, but had requested additional time, a standard delay tactic preceding aggressive response. That evening, I removed personal belongings from the apartment, taking only what I had acquired independently of Elise's provision. I left all gifts, clothing purchased for events, and items associated with the film or foundation. I documented the condition of the apartment and my departure, anticipating potential claims of property damage or theft. As I closed the door for the final time, I experienced not regret, but resolution. The following day would begin a process of reclaiming narrative authority over my own life. The outcome remained uncertain, but the action itself represented liberation from exploitation disguised as opportunity. I spent that night at Miguel's apartment, reviewing likely scenarios with my small circle of allies. We anticipated immediate counterattack, questioning my credibility and motives. We prepared for potential legal threats regarding confidentiality or defamation. We established communication protocols to maintain coordination regardless of public pressure. As midnight approached, I received a text from Elise. She requested my presence at a breakfast meeting with Foundation donors the following morning. The timing suggested she remained unaware of the imminent publication. Her continued confidence in her narrative control reinforced the necessity of my action. I did not respond to the message. Tomorrow would bring conversation of entirely different nature. Tomorrow would begin the dismantling of the false narrative she had constructed using my life as raw material. Tomorrow would initiate my reclamation of authorship over my own experiences. As I prepared for sleep in the unfamiliar room, I recalled Elise's whispered words from our first meeting. She had recognized an opportunity that night in the alley. She had identified a resource to be harvested for her advancement. She had calculated the value of my experiences and determined how best to extract it while maintaining plausible deniability regarding appropriation. What she had failed to anticipate was that I might eventually recognize the true nature of our arrangement, that I might document the process of exploitation, that I might reclaim narrative control using the very techniques she had demonstrated, that I might transform from resource into author of my own story. The next morning would begin that transformation. The next morning would reveal whether authenticity could successfully challenge carefully constructed mythology. The next morning would determine whether the invisible could become visible on their own terms, rather than through appropriation. The next morning would initiate the reckoning Elise Harlow had never anticipated when she whispered about opportunity in a darkened alley. The revenge. The morning the story broke, I woke before dawn. My phone had been silenced, but the screen illuminated repeatedly with incoming calls and messages. I ignored them all, focusing instead on mental preparation for the day ahead. The publication had released the article online at midnight, with print edition appearing on newsstands throughout Los Angeles as the city awakened. The headline was measured rather than sensational. Award-winning performance raises questions about artistic attribution. The subtitle directly addressed the core issue. Source claims direct appropriation without acknowledgement. My name appeared. In the first paragraph, establishing clear ownership of the allegations rather than relying on anonymous sourcing. The article presented my account alongside supporting evidence, recordings of Elise discussing how she would incorporate my mannerisms and experiences, documents showing systematic study of my background and personality, testimony from Miguel and others confirming that specific narrative elements reflected my actual experiences shared with them years before meeting Elise. Most damaging was the material addressing her explicit rejection of proper attribution. The journalist had effectively contextualized Elise's statement that audiences preferred the myth of artistic inspiration over the reality of appropriation. This framing highlighted the calculated nature of her decision to exclude acknowledgement of my contribution. The article also presented broader context regarding Hollywood's history of appropriating marginalized experiences while excluding authentic voices from the creative process. Industry experts discussed the ethical considerations of building performances from direct observation of specific individuals without proper acknowledgement or compensation. The piece elevated my specific complaint to representation of systemic issues. Elise's team had provided brief statement expressing disappointment regarding my actions. They characterized our relationship as generous mentorship that had provided substantial benefits, including housing, employment, and inclusion in significant industry events. They suggested my allegations represented misunderstanding of artistic process and unfortunate ingratitude for extraordinary opportunities. The statement carefully avoided addressing specific evidence while establishing narrative of benevolent patron and ungrateful recipient. The approach was predictable in both content and tone. It positioned Elise as victim of misrepresentation rather than perpetrator of appropriation. It framed the issue as personal grievance rather than ethical violation. By 7 that morning, the story had been picked up by entertainment news outlets and was generating significant social media discussion. Industry figures maintained careful neutrality, awaiting consensus before committing to position. Advocacy organizations focused on artistic representation expressed interest in the ethical questions raised. Film critics began reassessing Elise's celebrated performance through lens of potential appropriation. At 8, I received message from the journalist who had published the initial article. Elise's publicity team had announced press conference for later that morning. They had requested my presence to address the situation directly. The invitation appeared to offer opportunity for resolution, but likely represented attempt to control the narrative through direct confrontation. After consulting with Miguel and reviewing potential scenarios, I declined participation. Direct engagement in format controlled by Elise's team would surrender the narrative leverage I had established. The press conference environment would maximize her performance advantages while minimizing opportunity for substantive discussion of ethical concerns. Instead, I provided brief statement to the journalist. I expressed willingness to meet with Elise privately with appropriate representation present for both parties. I emphasized that my objective remained acknowledgement of contribution rather than financial compensation. I reaffirmed the accuracy of all evidence provided and welcomed further verification by interested parties. At 10, Elise conducted her press conference without my presence. She appeared without makeup, dressed simply in contrast to her usual carefully styled presentations. The visual messaging suggested authenticity and vulnerability rather than calculation. Every element of her appearance had been designed to establish sympathetic reception. She began by expressing deep personal hurt regarding my allegations. She described our relationship as meaningful connection, transcending social boundaries. She acknowledged drawing inspiration from our friendship, but characterized this as natural artistic process rather than exploitation. She presented numerous examples of her generosity and support, positioning herself as benevolent mentor, blindsided by unexpected betrayal. When addressing specific evidence, she employed strategic contextualization, recordings of her discussing, "My mannerisms became study of universal human experience rather than targeted appropriation. Documents analyzing my background and personality became general research into socioeconomic realities. Her rejection of formal attribution became protection of artistic integrity rather than career calculation. The performance was masterful in its technical execution. Her voice modulated perfectly between composed professionalism and controlled emotion. Her body language conveyed openness and transparency. Her narrative established plausible alternative interpretation for each piece of evidence while avoiding direct denial that might later prove problematic. Most effective was her expression of continued concern for my welfare despite my actions. She suggested environmental factors and past trauma might explain my misinterpretation of our relationship. She offered forgiveness and ongoing support rather than legal response. She positioned herself as compassionate superior rather than exposed exploiter. The performance would likely have proven persuasive to casual observers. However, the publication had simultaneously released additional materials online, complete recordings rather than excerpts, full documents rather than selected portions, comprehensive timeline establishing systematic pattern rather than isolated incidents. By early afternoon, the narrative momentum had shifted. Industry commentators began questioning the calculation behind Elise's press conference. Advocacy organizations issued statements supporting the ethical concerns raised by my account. Film critics published reassessments of her performance, highlighting specific elements that appeared directly appropriated from documented experiences. Most significantly, 3 former assistants contacted the journalist with similar accounts. They described Elise's established pattern of identifying individuals with compelling life experiences, extracting their stories through apparent friendship, then incorporating these elements into performances without acknowledgement. My case represented consistent methodology rather than isolated incident. At 3, Elise's director released statements supporting her artistic integrity while acknowledging potential need for industry-wide examination of attribution practices. The qualified nature of his support suggested recognition that complete defense had become untenable. The pivot toward broader systemic discussion represented an attempt to dilute individual accountability. By evening, the story had expanded beyond entertainment news to mainstream media coverage. The narrative increasingly focused on power dynamics in creative industries and exploitation of marginalized experiences. My specific allegations became entry point for broader conversation about who controls and benefits from authenticity in artistic representation. Throughout this period, I maintained minimal public engagement. I provided brief clarifications when requested by the original journalist, but declined all interview requests. I monitored developments from Miguel's apartment, accompanied by the small circle who had supported my decision to speak publicly. Their presence provided both practical assistance and emotional grounding as events accelerated. The following morning brought significant development. The foundation Elise had claimed to be establishing issued statement from legal representatives. They clarified that while preliminary discussions had occurred, no formal organization existed, no paperwork had been filed, no funding had been secured beyond initial planning grant. The promised vehicle for addressing youth homelessness remained entirely conceptual despite public references to its imminent launch. This revelation substantially undermined Elise's narrative of generous mentorship and social commitment. The foundation had featured prominently in her press conference as evidence of genuine dedication to addressing issues raised in the film. Its non-existence contradicted her presentation of meaningful action beyond performance. By midday, industry response had visibly shifted. Performers known for socially conscious positioning began expressing support for proper attribution practices. Directors and producers issued statements about their own approaches to research and representation. Film critics published analyses of previous performances by Elise, identifying potential patterns of appropriation throughout her career evolution. Most damaging was statement from the young actor who had portrayed the character based on me. He described being directed to study recordings of my conversations with Elise. He confirmed receiving specific guidance to incorporate my mannerisms, speech patterns, and emotional responses. His account directly contradicted Elise's claim that the character represented composite creation rather than specific appropriation. That afternoon, the prestigious industry organization that had presented Elise's award announced review of situation. While not rescinding recognition, they expressed commitment to establishing clearer ethical guidelines regarding attribution and representation. The statement acknowledged the legitimate questions raised by my account and supporting evidence. By evening, Elise's position had become increasingly untenable. Her initial narrative of grateful mentorship had collapsed under evidential weight. Her professional reputation faced serious reconsideration. Her carefully constructed image as authentic artist and advocate sustained significant damage. The transformation she had engineered using my experiences now threatened her career rather than advancing it. At 9 that evening, I received message from Elise's personal attorney rather than publicity team. The communication proposed private meeting to discuss resolution amenable to both parties. The shift from public performance to private negotiation signaled recognition that narrative control had been lost. The situation now required damage management rather than character assassination. After consultation with Miguel and others who had supported my action, I agreed to meeting with specific conditions. Independent representation must be present for both parties. Comprehensive acknowledgement of accurate attribution must be central to any resolution. Financial compensation would be considered, but remained secondary to public recognition of contribution. The meeting occurred the following morning at neutral location. Elise arrived with attorney and single advisor rather than entourage. Her appearance suggested exhaustion rather than calculated presentation. The physical impact of narrative collapse manifested in visible tension and diminished performance energy. Her attorney began by suggesting mutual non-disclosure agreement with financial settlement, standard approach to containing potentially damaging situations. The proposal included funding for the previously promised foundation, with position for me in its operation. The terms effectively offered payment for renewed silence. My representative countered with alternative framework. Public acknowledgement of my direct contribution to the creation of the character. Formal credit in all future presentations of the film, including streaming releases and international distribution. Establishment of the foundation with independent governance, ensuring mission fulfillment regardless of public relations value. Initial negotiation continued for several hours without Elise's active participation. She remained largely silent, observing the process with uncharacteristic passivity. The performance energy that typically dominated any space she occupied had diminished significantly. The absence of audience beyond immediate participants appeared to disorient her engagement. Mid-afternoon, she suddenly interrupted technical discussion between representatives. She requested private conversation with me, separate from advisors. My representative advised against such arrangement. Elise persisted, suggesting brief, direct communication might facilitate understanding that technical negotiation was failing to establish. After consideration, I agreed with modification. Representatives would remain present but allow direct exchange without intervention unless legally necessary. This approach maintained appropriate protection while permitting the personal communication Elise appeared to believe might resolve the situation. When others moved to opposite end of conference room, Elise spoke directly for first time. Her voice lacked the performance modulation that typically characterized her communication. She asked simply what I truly wanted from this process. Beyond legal frameworks and public statements, beyond foundation establishment and financial considerations, my actual objective. The question's directness surprised me. I responded with equal candor. I wanted acknowledgement that my life experiences had formed the foundation of her celebrated performance. I wanted recognition that authentic representation required proper attribution rather than appropriation. I wanted restoration of narrative, authority over my own story rather than continued exploitation disguised as opportunity. She studied me with expression I had never observed previously. The calculated assessment that had characterized our early interactions had disappeared. The practiced empathy of our later association was similarly absent. For perhaps the first time, she appeared to see me as actual person rather than resource or potential complication. After extended silence, she spoke with uncharacteristic hesitation. She acknowledged that her initial approach to our relationship had been primarily extractive. She had recognized opportunity to enhance her artistic credibility through access to experiences entirely outside her own. She had calculated the professional advantages of association with authentic struggle without experiencing its actual constraints. She described gradual shift in perspective as our association continued. Initial extractive intention evolved toward genuine connection. Exploitation became complicated by unexpected recognition of shared humanity, despite drastically different circumstances. Calculation developed emotional dimension she had not anticipated. This evolution created internal conflict she had never resolved. Professional advancement required maintaining narrative of artistic alchemy rather than acknowledging specific appropriation. Personal ethics increasingly questioned the fundamental imbalance of our association. Her response to this conflict had been continued performance rather than authentic reconciliation. The awards ceremony had forced unavoidable confrontation with this contradiction. Accepting industry's highest recognition for portraying experiences, she had systematically harvested from my life while minimizing my contribution had crystallized the fundamental dishonesty of her position. My absence from her acknowledgements represented professional calculation, overwhelming ethical consideration. Her explanation contained neither request for forgiveness nor attempt to justify previous actions. She simply offered context for choices that had ultimately damaged us both. The performance of contrition that might have characterized such discussion in other circumstances was notably absent. The conversation felt unexpectedly authentic despite the controlled environment. After she finished speaking, I acknowledged the complicated reality she had described. I expressed understanding that systems often incentivize exploitation while punishing ethical transparency. I suggested that her position offered opportunity to challenge these systems rather than perpetuating their operation. The conversation shifted toward potential resolution, reflecting this shared understanding. We discussed framework for public acknowledgement that would provide appropriate attribution while maintaining her professional dignity. We considered foundation structure that would address genuine needs rather than serving primarily as reputation management. We explored potential collaboration based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. When representatives rejoined conversation, we presented revised approach to resolution. Elise would issue statement acknowledging my direct contribution to character creation and performance development. Film credits would be modified for future releases to include appropriate attribution. The foundation would proceed with independent oversight and meaningful involvement from those with lived experience of homelessness. The formal agreement required additional days to finalize. Throughout this process, Elise maintained direct communication rather than operating through representatives. The performance elements that had characterized our previous interactions diminished significantly. The negotiation proceeded with unexpected authenticity from someone who had built career on controlled presentation. 1 week after the initial publication, resolution was announced. Elise issued statement acknowledging that her award-winning performance had been substantially based on my specific experiences, mannerisms, and personality rather than composite creation or artistic intuition. She expressed regret for inadequate attribution and committed to establishing clearer ethical boundaries in future projects. Industry response reflected complex recalibration. Some colleagues praised her courage in acknowledging mistake and accepting accountability. Others maintained distance, recognizing potential professional liability in expressing either support or condemnation. The prestigious organization that had presented her award issued statement supporting the resolution while announcing development of formal guidelines regarding attribution and appropriation. The foundation proceeded with accelerated timeline and modified structure. Governance included equal representation from entertainment industry and those with lived experience of homelessness. Programming emphasized authentic voice and proper attribution rather than exposure to celebrity influence. My role involved program development rather than public representation, reflecting my preference for substantive contribution over visibility. In subsequent months, the industry experienced wider examination of representation practices. Directors and producers faced increased scrutiny regarding research methods and attribution standards. Performers known for immersive preparation received specific questions about sources and acknowledgement. The conversation expanded beyond my particular situation to address systemic issues of power, appropriation, and authentic representation. Elise herself withdrew temporarily from public engagements. Her next project, announced 6 months later, involved collaboration with writer who received prominent credit for providing authentic perspective. Her promotional interviews emphasized importance of proper attribution and ethical research practices. Whether this represented genuine evolution or strategic adaptation remained unclear. Our personal communication continued intermittently, primarily regarding foundation development. The dynamics had fundamentally shifted from extraction disguised as mentorship to cautious collaborative engagement. The performance elements never entirely disappeared, but diminished significantly when financial or reputational advantages were removed from interaction. The film itself acquired additional context through this process, critically re-examined its portrayal of marginalized experience, revealed both genuine insight and problematic appropriation. The complexity of this assessment reflected broader industry reckoning with fundamental questions about who can tell which stories and how attribution should function when crossing experiential boundaries. For me, the resolution brought neither complete victory nor perfect justice. The systematic appropriation of my experiences could not be undone through subsequent acknowledgement. The power differential that had enabled the initial exploitation remained largely intact, despite public recognition of its operation. The structural inequities that made such appropriation possible continued throughout the industry. Nevertheless, the outcome represented significant shift from complete erasure to partial recognition. My experiences remained incorporated into Elise's celebrated performance, but now with appropriate attribution rather than invisible appropriation. My voice had emerged from exploitation to challenge the systems designed to maintain such extraction. My story had reclaimed its authorship despite the machinery deployed to maintain its anonymous harvesting. Perhaps, most importantly, the process established precedent for others facing similar situations. The resolution demonstrated potential pathway from exploitation to acknowledgement. The public conversation created space for examining practices previously accepted without questioning. The industry confrontation with appropriation dynamics opened possibility for evolving standards rather than continued exploitation. The primary revenge against Elise ultimately emerged not through her public humiliation or career destruction, but through fundamental recalibration of her carefully constructed narrative. The story she had created to advance her career now included acknowledgement of its actual origins. The authenticity she had claimed through appropriation now required recognition of its specific source. The social consciousness she had performed now necessitated actual ethical engagement. For someone who had built identity on controlled narrative and perfect performance, this forced authenticity represented more meaningful consequence than financial penalty or professional ostracism. The requirement to acknowledge appropriation rather than maintain myth of artistic alchemy challenged her fundamental self-conception and public presentation more profoundly than any external punishment could achieve. 1 year after the publication that transformed both our lives, I stood in the community center that had become the Foundation's primary program location. The space operated in the same neighborhood where I had once sought shelter in doorways and alleys. The renovated building now provided resources, training, and genuine opportunities for young people facing circumstances similar to those I had experienced. The center represented the most tangible outcome of the confrontation with Elise. Unlike many celebrity-affiliated charities that prioritize publicity over impact, this operation maintained focus on substantive assistance rather than public relations value. The governance structure ensured program decisions emerged from actual needs rather than promotional opportunities. The staffing prioritized lived experience alongside professional expertise. My role had evolved from initial program development to ongoing advisory capacity. I had discovered unexpected satisfaction in transforming personal hardship into systemic support for others. The skills developed for survival on the streets proved applicable to navigating institutional challenges and identifying practical solutions. The perspective gained through exploitation created particular sensitivity to ensuring authentic representation in all Foundation initiatives. The film that had catalyzed these events maintained complex legacy. Critics had reassessed the performance, following revelation of its specific inspiration, identifying elements of genuine brilliance alongside problematic appropriation. Industry discussions about representation had expanded beyond individual case to examine systemic practices. The prestigious award remained in Elise's possession, but carried additional context regarding its creation. More significantly, the industry had begun implementing attribution standards for performances based on specific individuals. Major studios developed protocols for acknowledging consultants who provided more than technical guidance. Award ceremonies introduced recognition categories for contributions previously rendered invisible. The conversation about authentic representation continued evolving beyond initial confrontation. My personal circumstances reflected similar complexity. The financial aspects of resolution provided stability I had never previously experienced. I had secured modest apartment purchased without assistance or control. I had established small business providing consultation regarding authentic portrayal of marginalized experiences in media projects. I had reconnected with educational opportunities. Abandoned during survival-focused adolescence, my relationship with Elise continued through foundation governance but maintained appropriate boundaries. The mentorship narrative had been permanently abandoned, replaced by cautious professional collaboration. Her approach to our interactions displayed less performance and greater authenticity, though the calculation never entirely disappeared. The power differential had diminished, though not equalized. Elise herself had experienced career recalibration rather than destruction. After brief withdrawal from public engagement, she had returned with projects emphasizing collaborative creation and proper attribution. Her interviews acknowledged the learning process regarding ethical representation. Her industry reputation reflected complex reassessment rather than simple cancellation or unmodified continuation. Whether these changes represented genuine evolution or strategic adaptation remained ambiguous. The authenticity that had formerly characterized her public persona now carried qualification through demonstrated history of calculated performance. The social consciousness she espoused faced increased scrutiny regarding alignment with actual practices. The narratives she presented encountered greater verification requirements from media and audiences. On rare occasions when we spoke privately, usually regarding foundation matters, I observed flickering recognition of this fundamental shift. Her carefully constructed identity had incorporated permanent complication. Her celebrated authenticity now contained irrevocable qualification. Her professional narrative included acknowledgement of appropriation alongside artistic achievement. For someone whose existence centered on controlling perception and performance, this mandated authenticity represented significant consequence. The necessity of acknowledging actual sources rather than maintaining artistic mythology challenged fundamental self-conception more profoundly than financial penalties or temporary professional limitations. My own perspective had similarly evolved. Through this process, the experience of exploitation created heightened awareness of systemic power imbalances throughout society. The navigation of public confrontation developed skills applicable to numerous situations requiring advocacy. The resolution process demonstrated potential pathways from victimization to reclaimed agency. Most importantly, I had recovered authorship of my own narrative. My experiences remained incorporated in Elise's celebrated performance, but now with appropriate attribution rather than invisible appropriation. My voice had emerged from exploitation to influence industry practices beyond individual situation. My story had reclaimed its ownership despite machinery deployed to maintain anonymous harvesting. As I walked through the community center that afternoon, observing young people accessing resources I had lacked, I recognized the unexpected outcome of what began as personal revenge. The confrontation had catalyzed institutional change, with impact beyond individual circumstances. The resolution had created structure for addressing needs more fundamental than reputational rehabilitation. The process had transformed exploitation into foundation for systemic improvement. That evening, I encountered media coverage of Elise's latest project. The promotional interviews emphasized collaborative process and proper attribution of sources. The production materials listed consultants with specific contribution acknowledgements. The narrative highlighted ethical representation rather than performative authenticity. Watching her navigate this evolved landscape, I recognized both calculation and genuine adaptation in her approach. The fundamental patterns remained visible beneath modified presentation. The performance continued with adjusted parameters. The ambition persisted through recalibrated methodology, yet meaningful change had undeniably occurred, despite imperfect transformation. Exploitation required acknowledgement rather than continuation. Appropriation faced consequences rather than reward. Invisibility had been replaced by recognition, however qualified by circumstances. The revenge ultimately manifested not through destruction, but through fundamental recalibration. The narrative Elise had constructed to advance her career now included permanent acknowledgement of its actual origins. The authenticity she had claimed through appropriation now required recognition of its specific source. The social consciousness she had performed now necessitated actual ethical engagement. For someone who had built identity on controlled narrative and perfect performance, this forced authenticity represented more meaningful consequence than financial penalty or professional ostracism. The requirement to acknowledge appropriation, rather than maintain myth of artistic alchemy, challenged her fundamental self-conception more profoundly than external punishment could achieve. As for myself, the process had transformed invisibility into recognition on my own terms. The experiences that had been harvested as raw material now carried acknowledged authorship. The voice that had been appropriated now influenced systemic practices. The story that had been exploited now belonged authentically to its original owner. The whispered words from our first meeting remained significant, but with entirely different meaning. Elise had recognized opportunity that night in the alley, but the ultimate opportunity had proven different than either of us anticipated. Not exploitation disguised as mentorship, but confrontation resulting in systemic recalibration. Not invisibility transformed into resource, but authentic voice emerging through conflict. The perfume that once haunted me had lost its power. The memory remained, but without continued exploitation. The experience had transformed from ongoing wound to resolved narrative. The path forward contained neither perfect justice nor complete reconciliation, but something more complex and ultimately more meaningful. The opportunity she had whispered about had manifested in ways neither of us could have possibly imagined when worlds collided that night in the darkened alley.